All right, hi everyone. My name is Lizik, a first year PhD student working with Xiaoyang. Today I'll be sharing my beginning of my PhD work on the Okmok volcano, and it is located in the central Aleutian Arc of Alaska. And these are some really beautiful satellite imagery showing the caldera itself. Historically has been formed by two caldera-forming eruptions, one in the late Pleistocene, 12,000 years ago, and another in the late Holocene, about 2,000 years before present. So very picturesque. Normally, it's covered with a lot of snow, and then in the summers you get these little glacier lakes. And neighboring to the main part of Okmok, it's situated on Okmok Island. Neighboring to it in the southwest, lobe of the island, are two other smaller volcanoes, the Sevedov and Mount Rochesnoy. So that's just some context here. And as for the location in the Aleutian Islands, you might have heard of some other more popular or actively ongoing research happening with seismic monitoring of Chichaldine or Cleveland volcano. And Okmok is on the third largest island in the Aleutian Islands, and about 100 kilometers or so from Unalaska Dutch Harbor. And this is significant because this is a major fishing industry area, and any volcanic activity from any of the volcanoes in this region, ash clouds will travel with the northwesterly winds in that dominant direction and influence the environment there. And again, there are over 50 active volcanoes along this Aleutian Arc, and Okmok is one of the most active ones in the past century. Has an eruptive cycle of every 10 to 20-ish years. So what's motivating my research is particularly the location of Okmok. It is right underneath the major North Pacific air traffic corridor. And we have a lot of both local and international flights crossing the North Pacific Ocean and over the Bering Sea. And so this is very important for the Alaska Volcano Observatory and USGS for monitoring purposes. And with its eruption cycle of every 10 to 20 years, it has recorded history of about 11 eruptions in the past century, with its latest one being in 2008, July 2008. And we'll talk about that more in the next slide. So past eruptions have been on the scale, or on the eruptive behavior, from effusive to explosive. 2008 one was very explosive, and we saw ash plumes rising over 10 kilometers in altitude. So this is a major threat to aviation, and to a slightly lesser degree, the fishing industry and other local populations. There are local communities along the Aleutian Islands as well. This is a photo taken from a northeastbound flight coming in across the Aleutian Islands from the Global Volcanism Program in the Smithsonian Institute. This is about a little over a month after the 2008 eruption. Just wanted to show you, even though I'm not focusing on the seismic monitoring side of things, that it is an active volcano, and this is an example of when it is actively erupting, what it looks like from the aerial view. So before I jump into the imaging and methods part of my talk, I would like to briefly discuss the intra-caldera eruptive features, as we're seeing in this photo from AVO. There are a lot of different eruptive cones that have formed over the course of its eruption history, and this is indicative of lateral magma migration within this caldera. So there we go. So we can see the outlined rim of the caldera showing the two very old caldera forming eruptions that initially formed the caldera, and then within the intracaldera, there are all these cones, and the important note is that post 1817, so basically after the early 1800s, we had most of our eruptions through 1997 have occurred at this cone A. And with the latest 2008 eruption, now we have this new tephra cone that is formed northwest of cone D. So, yeah, and dubbed a monolox. And this is something that we have seen in past eruptions, and with a new vent formation, usually coincides with an eruption at this caldera. And for scale, I wanted to put this into perspective of the 2008 eruption and how explosive this volcano can be, even though it is a basalt andesitic shield volcano. And it's fairly small, but the 2008 eruption had about a quarter cubic kilometer of tephra material that was ejected from this volcano, and that is pretty comparable with the Mount St. Helens 1980 eruption. And so that's what I'm showing here in comparison to more famous super volcanic eruptions of Yellowstone caldera, Long Valley. And that is why it is of concern and of interest to the AVO and USGS for continued volcanic hazard assessments, monitoring, and then imaging. So for this study, we want to understand with this volcano, what is the spatial distribution of these magma reservoirs or reservoir? So how is magma stored under the volcano, and where are they located, not just spatially, but at what depth levels? And then how might we understand the geometry and structure of the plumbing system as a whole, from magma transporting itself from subsurface, all the way to the surface, and the pathway that it takes. And then finally, how do our imaging results compare with past studies? There have been previous tomographic studies using dominantly local earthquake tomography that have shown there are two low velocity zones located beneath the caldera, one somewhere between the surface and 2 kilometer depth below sea level, with another slightly deeper between the 4 to 6 kilometer depth. And this is a shear wave velocity model from Kasatkina et al. 2002 paper. And yeah, they inferred that there are multiple shallow magma sources. And what this study, my study, aims to do is both cross-validate what previous researchers have shown, but also using a different methodology that may highlight new and different subsurface features that were not previously identified or as clearly resolved. And next, I'm going to jump into data and methodology. So here is a map of Okmok's caldera on the northwest or northeast lobe of Okmok Island. And here are my seismic stations that I'm using for this study. I'm using 17 permanent stations from the AVO network, as well as 13 temporary stations that were deployed in 2015 through 2016. And with that, we are harnessing for our seismic source, instead of local earthquakes, we're using ambient noise, and we heard a little bit about that earlier today. So ambient noise, the background hum of the earth, and multiple different sources, both urban and environmental, based on where Okmok is located in the Aleutian Islands. We're mainly the main source of our seismic energy is coming from ocean microseisms. So from these breaking waves of the sea crashing against the crust of the earth. And in particular, we're focusing on the Rayleigh waves, surface waves. So mostly the energy is low frequencies. You might be wondering, so why are we using ambient noise? some of the advantages of this over some other methods would be that it's, not less costly, avoids harmfully having to detonate some explosive device or do borehole drilling. So less intrusive. Most of this can be done remotely because thanks to the different volcano observatories and our global seismic stations are deployed around the world. We can access that data readily from like the IOS DMC. And then also because of Okmok's location being right, around this body of North Pacific Ocean and the Bering Sea, we just have a lot of ambient noise. So prime spot for this study. Next question being, so once we have this ambient noise, these raw ambient noise waveforms, how can we harness this into something interpretable and useful? So what I'm next going to talk about is the cross correlation of these ambient noise waveforms from seismic station pairs that I showed previously on seismic station map. And effectively, by performing cross correlation of these waveforms, we are able to extract or obtain the empirical Green's function, which is the impulse of the Earth's response basically carries information about the waves traveling from station to station. And since there is no actual source, every station is acting as a virtual source relative to each other. This is a schematic showing how this works. So we have, for example, these are my two sensors or seismic stations that are picking up our ambient noise waveforms, which then when we perform cross correlation, we get a different waveform that captures, we're basically comparing the similarity in these waves, and information that's captured by this station should also be captured by this station with the waves traveling between the two, even though they are their unique waveforms are different from each other. This hopefully will play. I don't know how to get this. Right. So how this works is we take different time slices of our cross correlation of our raw waveforms, and we have different time segments, and then basically move with a sliding window across each other. And this is showing autocorrelation. And the next example, I guess not gonna, maybe it already played, is using cross correlation where we take two different waveforms that have, we're still looking at the same time window, but they're two different waveforms instead of the same waveform correlating with itself. So once we do that, we have our empirical Green's functions approximately, and then we move into the full wave ambient noise tomography workflow. And to break it down very broadly, there are three main steps. We can understand it as one, we need to compute synthetic waveforms to be able to compare with our empirical Green's functions. And so one of the first things I'll be showing you is some results from my wave simulations through the finite difference method. And then secondly, we compare in a different form of cross correlation between our synthetic and empirical Green's functions. This allows us to measure the phase delay times. And that is important because then after we perform that, we have the necessary information we need to move to the next step, which is calculating our sensitivity kernels and then inverting for velocity perturbations to get our final velocity model, structure model. All right, and so this is first an example of stacked waveforms over the course of several months between stations AVOKCE and AVOKFG. And as we can see here, the main Rayleigh wave arrivals appear to be around 11 seconds. And these waveforms look very strong and nicely symmetrical, which would indicate that we are making, when we work with ambient noise, we are making an assumption that we have almost uniform distribution of noise sources. And this symmetry is then reflected in the cross-correlation function. So this is our empirical Green's function. These are now move-out plots of the empirical Green's functions from our cross-correlations, and it's from OKFG with all my others. So I had about 30 seismic stations in total, and each of these traces is one of my EGFs. The longest period that we're seeing where we can detect a wave arrival would be around 10 seconds. So this is like 5 to 10 seconds, and then all the way to 1 to 2 seconds. These are 6 overlapping frequency bands that we'll be using further for inversion later on. Next, I'd like to show the little animation of my simulation when I went through doing the finite difference method to obtain my synthetic waves. I'm able to use a vertical point source as in simulation to in the center of my island. So that's what that black dot there is representing. And when I play this video, it'll show the propagation. Show the propagation of these wave fields. So first, what we're seeing here in these bright rings of yellow and blue are main body waves, and then later on are surface waves propagating. It gets a little harder to see here, but the light, for some reason, the color bar here is not here, but the blues and the reds represent amplitudes. Blue being the high amplitudes, red being the low amplitudes. And this all happens, I slowed down the playback of this simulation by at least a quarter. And so actually the time that it takes for these waves to propagate across the entirety of this part of the island is about 10 seconds, which makes sense, is consistent with the speed at which we assume surface waves would travel across the island. It is about 30 by 40-ish kilometers. And then just further look at this, here are some snapshots at specific time points of like 1.5 seconds, 2.5 seconds, and then 3.5 seconds for seeing those surface waves pretty much covered the entire section of the caldera. So for future work, looking ahead, we have not yet performed the full wave inversion step, but that we expect to finish in the next month or so. And this process will be an iterative approach where we're using a damped least squares method as detailed in Gao and Shen, 2014 paper. And so with this, some of you might be familiar with this approach, but essentially we're starting with a reference Earth model. I'm using the AK-135 model, reference model, combining that with Kasatkina's 2022 paper, which I was showing you their velocity model. So we're using their reference velocities with the AK-135 model and for wave simulations, and then with our empirical Green's functions, and being able to use that data, this becomes a optimization problem of trying to reduce the misfit between our observed data and our synthetics. And we'll keep updating this velocity model until our velocity model can explain our observed data as best as it can. Yeah, and thank you.